The phone rang at 2:17 a.m., and Clara knew it was bad news. No one called at that hour unless the world was ending or someone was dying. She fumbled for her phone, her heart pounding. The screen lit up with a number she didn't recognize, but the area code was familiar. It was from her hometown, a place she hadn't set foot in for over a decade. She hesitated, her thumb hovering over the answer button. Part of her wanted to let it go to voicemail, but the part that still remembered what it felt like to be a little girl waiting for her dad to come home won out. "Hello," she answered, her voice groggy. "Clara." The voice was hesitant, almost apologetic. It was a man's voice, deep and gravelly, but with a softness that made her stomach twist. She hadn't heard that voice in years, but she would have recognized it anywhere. "Dad?" she whispered, her throat tightening. "Yeah, it's me," he said, his voice cracking slightly. I didn't know who else to call." Clara sat up in bed, her mind racing. This wasn't like him. Her father was a proud man, stubborn and self-reliant to a fault. He didn't ask for help, not from anyone, and certainly not from her. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Are you okay?" There was a long pause, and then he let out a shaky breath. "I'm sick, Clara," he said. "Real sick. The doctors, they don't think I have much time left." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Her father had always been larger than life, a force of nature. He wasn't supposed to get sick. He wasn't supposed to die. What are you talking about?" she stammered. "What's wrong with you?" "Cancer," he said simply. "Stage 4. It's everywhere. They've done all they can, but it's not enough." Clara felt tears welling up in her eyes, but she blinked them away. She didn't want to cry, not now, not in front of him. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "I know I don't deserve it, but I'd like to see you before it's too late." Clara's heart ached at the raw vulnerability in his voice. This wasn't the man she remembered. The man she remembered was tough, unyielding, always in control. This man sounded broken, defeated, and it scared her. "I'll come," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll be there as soon as I can." There was another long pause, and then he let out a breath. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. I'll see you soon." The line went dead, and Clara sat there in the dark, the phone still pressed to her ear. Her mind was racing, 1,000 thoughts and emotions swirling around inside her. All she knew was that her father was dying, and she was going home for the first time in over a decade. The flight home was a blur. Clara spent most of it staring out the window, replaying the conversation with her father over and over again. She couldn't shake the sound of his voice, the way it had cracked when he told her he was sick. It was so unlike him, so unlike the man she remembered. The man she remembered was strong, stoic, always in control. He was the kind of man who never showed weakness, never asked for help. But now he was just a man who was dying and who needed her. The thought made her chest tighten, and she had to force herself to take a deep breath. She didn't know what to expect when she got home, didn't know what to say to him. They hadn't spoken in over a decade, and the last time they had, it had ended in a fight that had driven her away, that had kept her away for all these years. But now none of that seemed to matter. All that mattered was that he was sick, and he wanted to see her. And despite everything, she knew she had to go. The plane touched down just after noon, and Clara grabbed her bag and headed for the rental car counter. She hadn't told anyone she was coming, hadn't even told her father when to expect her. She just wanted to get there, to see him, to what? She didn't know. She just knew she had to go. The drive to her hometown was familiar, the roads winding through the countryside just as she remembered them. The fields were still green, the trees still tall and proud. It was like stepping back in time, like nothing had changed. But everything had changed. She had changed. She pulled into the driveway of her childhood home and sat there for a moment, just staring at the house. It looked smaller than she remembered, the paint peeling in places, the garden overgrown. It looked tired, just like her father. She took a deep breath and got out of the car, her legs feeling like they were made of lead. She walked up to the front door and hesitated, her hand hovering over the knob. She didn't know what she was walking into, didn't know what to expect. But she knew she couldn't turn back now. She pushed the door open and stepped inside, the familiar smell of the house hitting her like a wave. It was a smell she hadn't realized she'd missed, a smell that brought back a flood of memories. Memories of her childhood, of her mother, of her father. Memories she hadn't allowed herself to think about in years. "Dad?" she called out, her voice trembling. "It's me. I'm here." There was a moment of silence, and then she heard footsteps coming down the hall. Her heart raced as she waited, her breath caught in her throat. And then he appeared, standing in the doorway, looking older and frilier than she'd ever seen him. "Clara," he said, his voice soft and filled with emotion. "You came." She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "I came," she whispered. And then, for the first time in over a decade, she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around her father, holding him tight as the tears finally came. The days that followed were a blur of emotions, of conversations, of memories. Clara spent most of her time at her father's side, listening as he told her stories about her childhood, about her mother, about the life they'd had before everything had fallen apart. It was strange, hearing him talk about those days. She'd spent so many years trying to forget them, trying to bury the pain and the anger that had driven her away. But now, hearing him talk about them, it was like she was seeing them in a new light. Like she was seeing him in a new light. He told her about the day she was born, about how he'd held her in his arms for the first time and known that he would do anything to protect her. He told her about her mother, about how much she'd loved her, about how much she'd loved him. He told her about the day she'd died, about how he'd felt like a part of him had died with her. And he told her about the years that followed, about how he'd tried to be both mother and father to her, about how he'd tried to keep her safe, to keep her happy. But he'd failed, he said. He'd failed her, and he was sorry. Clara listened to it all, her heart breaking with every word. She'd spent so many years blaming him, hating him for the way he'd pushed her away, for the way he'd tried to control her. But now, hearing him talk about it, she realized that he'd just been scared. Scared of losing her, scared of failing her, scared of being alone. And she realized that she'd been scared too. Scared of him, scared of the past, scared of the pain. But now, sitting there with him, listening to him talk, she realized that the pain was still there, but it was different. It wasn't the sharp, cutting pain of anger and resentment. It was the dull, aching pain of loss, of regret, of love. And she realized that she didn't want to be angry anymore. She didn't want to hold on to the past, to the pain. She just wanted to be with him, to make the most of the time they had left. As the days turned into weeks, Clara and her father fell into a routine. She would wake up early and make breakfast, just like her mother used to do. They would eat together, talking about nothing and everything, just enjoying each other's company. Then they would spend the day together, sometimes going for walks, sometimes just sitting in the living room, watching old movies or reading. It was strange how quickly they fell back into the rhythm of being father and daughter. It was like the years of silence, of anger, of pain had never happened. Like they were just picking up where they'd left off, all those years ago. But Clara knew it wasn't that simple. She knew that the past was still there, lurking in the background, waiting to be addressed. And she knew that they couldn't ignore it forever. One afternoon, as they were sitting on the porch, watching the sun set, Clara finally worked up the courage to bring it up. "Dad," she said, her voice hesitant, "can I ask you something?" He turned to look at her, his eyes soft and filled with love. "Of course, sweetheart. You can ask me anything." She took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. "Why did you push me away?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why did you try to control me? Why did you make me feel like I couldn't be myself?" He was silent for a long time, his eyes filled with pain. And then he let out a deep sigh and looked away, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I was scared," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I was scared of losing you, of failing you. I thought. I thought if I could just keep you close, if I could just protect you, then I wouldn't lose you. But I was wrong. I pushed you away, and I lost you anyway." Clara felt tears welling up in her eyes, but she blinked them away. "I just wanted you to love me for who I was," she said, her voice breaking. "I just wanted you to accept me, to support me. But you didn't. You tried to change me, to control me. And it hurt, Dad. It hurt so much." He turned to look at her, his eyes filled with tears. "I know," he said, his voice trembling. "And I'm so sorry, Clara. I'm so sorry for everything. I just wanted to keep you safe. But I didn't know how. I didn't know how to be the father you needed." Clara felt her heart breaking as she looked at him, at the pain and regret in his eyes. And she realized that she didn't want to be angry anymore. She didn't want to hold on to the past, to the pain. She just wanted to forgive him, to love him, to be with him. "I forgive you, Dad," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I forgive you." He looked at her, his eyes wide with surprise and hope. "You do?" he asked, his voice trembling. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I do," she said. "I love you, Dad. And I don't want to waste any more time being angry. I just want to be with you, to make the most of the time we have left." He reached out and took her hand, his grip strong despite his frailty. "I love you too, Clara," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "And I'm so proud of you, so proud of the woman you've become." And as they sat there, holding hands and watching the sun set, Clara felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. She knew that the past was still there, that the pain and the anger would always be a part of her. But she also knew that she didn't have to let it control her anymore. She could let it go, and she could move forward. And she could do it with her father by her side. The weeks turned into months, and Clara and her father continued to grow closer. They talked about everything, from the past to the present to the future. They laughed, they cried, they shared stories and memories. And they made new ones, ones that Clara knew she would cherish for the rest of her life. But as the days passed, Clara could see that her father was getting weaker. He was tired more often, and he spent more and more time in bed. She knew that their time together was running out, and it broke her heart. One evening, as they were sitting in the living room, her father turned to her and took her hand. "Clara," he said, his voice soft but firm, "there's something I need to tell you." She looked at him, her heart pounding in her chest. "What is it, Dad?" she asked, her voice trembling. He took a deep breath, his eyes filled with love and regret. "I'm not going to be around much longer," he said, his voice breaking. "And I need you to know that I'm so proud of you, so proud of the woman you've become. And I need you to know that I love you, more than anything in this world." Clara felt tears streaming down her face as she looked at him, at the man who had been her father, her protector, her hero. And she realized that she didn't want to say goodbye. She didn't want to lose him. "I love you too, Dad," she said, her voice breaking. "And I don't want to lose you. I don't want to say goodbye." He reached out and cupped her face in his hand, his touch gentle and loving. "You're not going to lose me, sweetheart," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "I'll always be with you. Always. And I need you to promise me something." She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Anything, Dad," she said. "I'll promise you anything." He smiled, his eyes filled with love. "Promise me that you'll live your life," he said, his voice firm. "That you'll be happy, that you'll follow your dreams, that you'll love and be loved. That's all I've ever wanted for you, Clara. That's all I've ever wanted." She nodded, her heart breaking as she looked at him. "I promise, Dad," she said, her voice trembling. "I promise." And as they sat there, holding each other and crying, Clara knew that she would keep that promise. She would live her life. She would be happy. She would follow her dreams. And she would do it for him, for the man who had loved her, who had protected her, who had been her father. Clara's father passed away a few weeks later, peacefully, in his sleep. She was by his side, holding his hand, telling him that she loved him. And as she sat there, watching him take his last breath, she felt a sense of peace. She knew that he was at peace, that he was no longer in pain. And she knew that he would always be with her, in her heart, in her memories, in the legacy he had left behind. She spent the next few weeks taking care of his affairs, going through his things, and saying goodbye to the house she had grown up in. It was hard, but it was also cathartic. It was a way for her to say goodbye, to let go of the past, and to move forward. And as she stood in the empty house, looking around at the walls that had once been filled with laughter and love, she realized that she was ready. Ready to live her life, to follow her dreams, to love and be loved. Ready to honor the promise she had made to her father. She took one last look around the house, her heart filled with love and gratitude. And then she turned and walked out the door, ready to face the future, ready to live the life her father had always wanted for her. And as she drove away, she knew that he was with her, that he would always be with her. And she knew that she would never forget him, that she would always carry him in her heart. Because he was her father, and she was his daughter, and nothing, not even death, could ever change that.